Okay, welcome to monthly PLC for science. We focus on a different science and engineering practice each month. This month's is obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information, which is something that we do every day, almost all day, especially in our social jobs. It looks like there are not a whole lot of people here, and so this is going to be me just kind of talking to myself for a little while. So since it needs to be a little bit more interactive for that for you, I'm not going to give any wait time, but when I ask you to do something, maybe hit pause on your screen if you're watching the recording, and take a couple minutes to reflect and think so that it doesn't just skip ahead, and that way you can make it at your own pace. And so I wanted to remind you that we do have this resource at montanamtscienceeducation.org, just one E between science and education. That's a key part to be able to log into that. And if you go to the toolkit for teachers, you can go to science and engineering practices, and it has all of the science and engineering practices here, as well as various resources for you to look at. So I'd like to start by just clicking on that and allowing you to see what that is. And so this is where I get a lot of the information. Embedded in here also a video by Paul Anderson, and so he explains the practice in detail. It'd be a nice place for you to go and look if you wanted just a little bit more information, background information about the practice. And so back to looking at obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information, take just a minute or two to read through both of these quotes from a framework from K12 Science Education. As a reminder, this is the text that came out of a National Research Council in 2012, and they made the recommendation for next generation science standards, which is where a lot of our basis of the Montana science standards come from. And so this is kind of that original research committee that put together that recommendation. And so what I'd like you to do is read their explanation of the science piece of this as well as the engineering piece. And so this would be a time for you to pause your screen and go through that. Okay, so what is really telling about these two quotes is that it is one of the only practices, and really one of the only, it's the only practice and one of the only pages in the book that talks about being able to propagate science or new ideas not happening without that practice. All of the practices are really important, but both the explanation for science and for engineering here starts with science cannot advance, engineers cannot produce. So if scientists are not communicating with each other, or if we're not using the discoveries of our predecessors and standing on those shoulders, then really what science and knowledge and new ideas are not evolving. And so this was very telling for me in how important this practice is. And I'm going to point out a couple of things on each of the grade bands here. And so as a reminder, this comes from Appendix F from the NGSS document, and it's a way to think about how students are progressing through just this practice. It gives you verbs for just this specific practice and what students look like or what you can observe when they are doing this. And you'll see a lot of integration into English language arts and Common Core. And I really encourage you to look at your writing standards and reading standards for your grade level. And I know a lot of 612 teachers thinking, well, I teach science, but there is a shared responsibility for you in English language arts that we're going to get to in just a moment. So I really want you to look through this portion for your grade level and pick out the verbs of what students are doing for this specific practice. And you want to pause your screen to do that. And there's a lot of, now that you're back, there's a lot of overlap here. And it says very specifically, read grade appropriate texts. You're describing, comparing ideas across various sources. Gather, read, and evaluate. technical information from multiple sources. And so really we're looking at English language arts in that science and technical text for informational standards, and that's in grades 6 through 12. And that's where a lot of those are embedded. And then in K through 5, it's our informational text standards in reading, writing, and conducting research. And so if you look at English language arts, Common Core in through OPI, I'll take you to the home page there so you can see what it looks like. I've downloaded this PDF ahead of time so that we can kind of navigate around. My plan was to do that as people were joining the meeting so that we could look at your particular content area or grade level. But I'm just going to show you a few key things here and then move on. And you can do that on your own since I'm kind of talking to myself today. Okay, and so I just downloaded this PDF, and this is what it looks like. I'm just going to go back up to the top. And you can kind of see that each grade band has their own set of standards. And really in K through 5, they're specific for each grade level. And when you get into K or 6 through 12, you'll notice that we have science and technical texts here. Now these are kind of embedded in the K through 5 standards that we have as elementary teachers, and I think the reason for that is because K through 5 teachers are typically teaching science and writing and reading, and so that's not necessarily specific to say, hey, you are responsible for these. But in 6 through 12, if I click on that, it's not necessarily broken down by grade level like it is in the earlier grades, but it's in those bands 6, 8, 9, 10, and 11, 12. And this is what's called a shared responsibility. And so depending on your district, you might have an English language arts teacher that's working on these, but more than likely these fall in your domain if you are a 6 through 12 science teacher in Montana. And so it's really important to look at these and become familiar with them. I know that our state tests for English language arts, the performance assessments, typically delve into these standards as well. And so collaboration between those teachers, science and English language arts, would be phenomenal if it's able to happen. And so I'm going to keep going. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what does student work look like if they're obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. If a student reads a passage and answers questions, have they used that information for something? Have they evaluated it, or are they finding something in the text that's already there? What kind of level of depth are we looking at here? And so I'm going to show you a couple videos, and I'm just going to let these videos play through, but what I want you to be looking for is what are students doing? What are the verbs? How in depth are they in these practices, especially in obtaining, evaluating, and communicating? What does it look like? These are all 5th grade examples. They're students of mine from just the past couple of years, just looking at some different videos that I had from the website from our classroom. And so look to see what surprises you, what you think is what you expected, how they're engaging as far as close reading, writing things down, talking about things. And it's hard to talk to yourself and not have anybody to talk to. So let this go.
It says many medicine drainage help died from starvation. So here, I mean, it's talking about how the teeth are disformed here too. So, but how does starvation prevent that? It's like the teeth.
And I'm just going to keep moving through the videos. And remember, pause my slideshow whenever you are reflecting so that I'm not rushing through it. So in this video, they were using borrowed artifacts from our Yellowstone Gateway Museum. And notice that communicating isn't always just writing a lab report or a engineering analysis report, as we had talked about during our last meeting. But in this, they're diagramming, really drawing detailed diagrams. They're using graphic organizers in a notebook. And so when they're taking in information, there's marks all over that paper. There's writing that's happening in the notebook. And they're truly evaluating that information for a reason. They have a task. This is an example of a student's notebook. And I can't remember if this was last year or 2 years ago, but it's basically just a snapshot of her notebook from that point in the year. So from the beginning of the year to whenever it was. And notebook is obviously a way to communicate. Okay, and so that was a slideshow of a student notebook from 5th grade. I think we may have had somebody join, but I'm not sure. So false. This is a 5th grade class from, I think it was 2000, whenever the oil spill was and the XL pipeline was happening, and they had researched it. And so I provided them with an article on each side of the debate, a pro-pipeline article and an anti-pipeline article, and then they were allowed to go and find up to 3 more sources. And so you had 5th grade students who had read 5 sources of adult level text. And so you'll see this is an entire class set, which means that every single student's work is represented in the video here. That means students with IEPs, or Title I students, all of them. And so you'll see them interacting with text in a very different way. And then it goes into some of the prep work that they did for their debate to talk about if they thought the XL pipeline should go in or not go in. And you'll see that they were doing direct quotes from some of their articles. And the result of this is that they had the debate. It was 45 minutes long, and they did not pass the pipeline by, I think it was 15 to 7, or it'll show up on this video. And then the students made a motion that if they said that if they could engineer the pipeline. And so they re-voted on if the 5th grade class was able to approve the blueprints for the pipeline, and they felt like it could be trusted structurally, and the pipeline then passed, which I thought was pretty ingenious of them. So I'll remind you to take pause and reflect and think about if there's anything out of this that you can use in your classroom, or if there's anything that surprised you, things that were expected, how are they interacting with text, how can you tell that they've evaluated what they've read, and how would you ask them to see if they can communicate what they know. And so I'm going to keep going. Go to another one.
So the population varies a lot because sometimes it goes from 650 all the way down to 200, and it's like, how can it do that so fast? And then it goes back up again. So it's like, we're wondering why, how does it always go up and down so quickly and so fast? And on the bottom of the article you're reading, it says 84 wolves were taken, with about 20 being harvested by hunters, and 141 were harvested by trappers and hunters, specifically targeting wolves. And on the next page,
I'm just going to pause this one here. because they're asking a lot of questions, and so that's communicating what's happening. And so they're just kind of delving into wolf population and hunting quotas and what that looks like and what that means. And so we live in Livingston, so that's kind of a hot topic here. But going into hot topics is something that is very rewarding and also kind of risky. I know that a lot of teachers are a little nervous about that. And so the way that I approach that in the room is that I never tell students my opinion and tell them that they can't know my opinion unless they come back in 3 years and ask me. That way they're even in a different building before that might happen. And so when approached by parents, because it does happen, I tell them that my purpose is not to back up any agenda, and that my opinion is not known to the classroom, and that they are looking to evaluate information and form opinions with guidance and understand data a little bit more. And usually, and I bring up the fact that it's a great talking point for parents because I won't tell them my opinion, but it's a good dinner conversation for them to have about school. And so then that student usually has more fiery research and goes even further than most other students. So the interaction with the parent is sometimes a little bit tricky, but it ends up also being very rewarding. And if a student cares about, if anybody cares about something as human beings, if we care about it, we're going to pursue it with a lot more passion than if it's something that's forced upon us. And if you want students to read and write and do it with fervor, then make it about an animal or a hot topic that they can get into, and it'll win. And so this is a video that was produced by students that happened during my math section of class, because I'm a 5th grade teacher, so I'm responsible for math standards as well. And so I just wanted to show you what obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information could look like in another subject, you know, outside of language arts and outside of science.
We're doing a problem that is 1/5 times 1/2 equals n. So 1/5 of 1/2, what is it? So this does not exist in this problem. It's 1/5 of 1/2, not 1/5 of a whole. This is 1/5 of a whole. We don't want this at all. So since it's 1/2 of a whole, that means the fraction of it, say 1/2, will be half the size as well. So this would be a 1/10 and not a 5th. And we want 1/5 of 1/2. So since these are fifths, like I explained, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then this is 1/5 of 1/2 instead. And again, this is 1/5 of 1 whole. And again, it's 1/2 of a whole, so everything becomes half the size. Here you can see it.
So that was just a little taste of that. Maybe pause your video and do a little bit of reflection. This video is going to be quite a bit shorter than an hour because the conversation, the collaboration is not there. And so I keep asking you to pause your video and make sure that you are thinking and reflecting on your own so that you can answer the questions for the discussion if you are listening to the recording. This is a list that was composed by the Idaho Writing Fellowship Project, and this was brought to my attention this past month with another project. And so I wanted to give Karen Miller credit. She's the one that, in Idaho, she's the one that composed this list. But these are examples of science writing, and so you can see the different genres: awareness science, environmental science, social science, science-themed memoir, science narrative, science fiction, science essays, and the list keeps going. But what's amazing about this list is that it has specific examples. And so, you know, we always think about looking at those exemplars and what is that and what are we striving for in the end. And so I just love this list and being able to, especially maybe some summer reading or kind of whatever you might be excited about on here. And then I wanted just to point out that obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information is considered, you know, officially practice 8. But the fact that these are numbered kind of misleads us and makes us think that they're separate or in a specific order. And really, any time that you are doing any of the other practices, you're also obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. Maybe on a larger scale for some rather than others, but it's important to remember that this practice supports other science and engineering practices. And then back to the framework, what we looked at earlier today, is that it really is the key to propagating new ideas and developing science. And then as far as being able to do research, ask questions, really dig into a concept, looking at them through various cross-cutting concepts and then coming back together is really interesting. For instance, if you were looking at cells and you wanted to find patterns in cells or cause and effect relationships, structure and function is something that is focused on quite a bit. Stability and change as far as disease or cancer, any of those cross-cutting concepts are going to give you a different view into the phenomena of cells. And so looking at them in kind of a systematic way and picking out cross-cutting concepts, maybe just a couple, not all 7, and jigsawing where different groups are researching or learning about or investigating different parts of that and communicating it to each other is another way to obtain, evaluate, and communicate information in a jigsaw style. So that is all I have for today. We got a little bit of a late start with some technical difficulties, and our meeting is a little bit short without the conversation. Remember, this is about collaboration and networking, so anytime you're able to attend and be here is amazing, but I hope that you've enjoyed the recording and have gotten some ideas. Thank you, and I hope to see you next month.